Okay, we're going to do some singing like we usually do. 1 second here. Okay, so this is a song, a nigun, from Hallel. During Hanukkah, all 8 days, we say the special series of psalms called Hallel, and this is one of the tunes. Hallel is very, very, very joyous, very, very joyous. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. Oh. Ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. Hey ding 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 ding. Hey ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. Oh. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Oh oh oh. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding ding ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. Oh. I ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. Oh. Ding 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 ding. I ding ding ding. Ding 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 ding. I ding ding ding. I ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. Oh. I ding 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 ding. I ding 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 ding. I oh. Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach. Okay, here we go. Yoni, are you there? Yona? Okay, I'm trying to record here. And he's not here. 1 second. Okay. Okay, this week's Parsha is called Miketz, which means at the end of. The first verse is at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. So according to tradition, Yosef spent a total of 12 years in jail. And it was 2 years from the time that he interpreted the dreams of the butler and the baker. And he asked the butler to remember him and to mention him to Pharaoh because he was in jail unjustly. But the butler didn't do that. So the parsha begins at the end of 2 years. At the end of 2 years of waiting, Pharaoh has a dream. And I think most people know the story. He has 2 dreams. And Yosef, no one can interpret them, or at least no one could interpret them in a way that Pharaoh liked. And then the butler remembers Yosef, and they bring him out of jail. He interprets the dreams, and in like a flash, he is now made the second most powerful man in Egypt, other than Pharaoh himself. So this is the storyline. And what Joseph is predicting, that what the dreams were saying, is that there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And that if Pharaoh was smart, he would take a very good percentage of the grain every year and store it for the 7 years of famine. That was the advice he gave, and on that advice, Pharaoh said, "You're the one. you must know what you're doing here." Okay, so what we're going to do today, we're going to look at one word. We're going to look at one word and see how deep we can go with this one word. So the 7 years of plenty pass, and the famine begins, exactly like Joseph said. And back in Israel, there is a famine also. And so Jacob says to his sons, "I see that there is shever." That's the word we're going to look at today. "I see there is shever in Egypt. Go down to Egypt and buy us grain." So what does this word shever mean in this context? In this context, it means that Jacob saw that there was grain to purchase. That's the root of this word shever, means that there's produce. In fact, one of the first department stores that opened in Israel was called the Mashbir, because Joseph, because he was feeding the whole world, he was called the Mashbir, the one who is providing food for everyone. So that's the simple understanding here. But we know that this word has a different meaning, a completely different meaning, and it means to break. Shever means brokenness, to break. So how do we understand the two meanings of the word here? So it's explained that Jacob, when he says this to his sons, is experiencing what's called unclear prophecy, meaning that if a person is on a certain level, without even understanding completely, he will say or think or do something that is prophetic in nature. So here, Jacob says, "Go down and buy us some food." But on another level, he was saying, "I see brokenness coming in Egypt," meaning that we are going to end up in Egypt and we're going to end up as slaves. Now, why did Jacob think such a thing? Is because it says that if you go back last week's Parsha, and we learned that the brothers and Joseph were not getting along at all. And so Jacob says to Joseph, "Go, I'm sending you to check on your brothers." And the text says he sent him from the valley of Hebron. So Rashi says an amazing thing. He says, what does it mean, the valley of Hebron? Hebron is not in the valley. It's in the mountains. What could he possibly have meant? So we have to understand that the word for valley in Hebrew, emek, is the same word for deep. That's why a valley is deep between two mountains. So Rashi says that he was sending him from the deep prophecy that God had given to Abraham, that his children, his descendants, would be slaves for 400 years in Egypt. So commentaries have been asking quite literally for thousands of years. When Jacob sent Joseph, did he understand that by Joseph being taken down to Egypt, that would begin the long exile in Egypt that would end up in slavery? Or he didn't understand, but he said the words and they were prophetic in nature. So that's the same thing in this week's portion. Is when Jacob says, I see there is food in Egypt, but it could also mean I see there's breaking about to happen in Egypt. Now, we're going to look at this a little bit deeper, because one of the deepest concepts that the great Kabbalist, the Arizal, who lived in Sfat about 500 years ago, he revealed what's called the breaking of the vessels. And he explains, what I'm going to explain in short is obviously a much deeper concept. But he says that just like the concept of reincarnation, that we're not here for the first time. Well, according to our mystic tradition, the whole reality of this world is not the first time that the world has been born, put it that way, like the Big Bang. There's something before it. And that world was called the world of chaos. And what happened in that world? The lights of that world were so strong, so pure, so awesome, that the vessels of creation could not hold the light, and they shattered. And this is what's called the breaking of the vessels. And the Arizal revealed that our reality right now is called the world of rectification. And what is this world made out of? The broken pieces of the previous world. So when Yaakov says, I see that there is breaking in Egypt, he was seeing the reality as it was about to unfold, as it was prophesied to Abraham. But it's based on a much deeper level, this idea called Shvirat HaKelim. Now, this whole class is called Growth Through Torah. So I want to take this very mystical idea and bring it down to our level. So I'm going to say a number of phrases here that I'm sure everyone has gone through many, many, many times. And this depicts what the breaking of the vessels is, meaning when the light is too great for the vessels to hold it. So we have expressions like, I'm freaking out. This is too much for me. I can't handle this. I need to get away. I need my space. I don't know what to do with myself right now. This is beyond me. Do some of these expressions sound familiar? I don't know about anyone else, but this is everyone's reality, not necessarily every day, but we're constantly going through situations where the energy, the light, is a bit too much for what we can handle. I can't handle this. This is what's called Shvirat HaKelim in our own lives. In other words, this mystical idea is not a cosmological description of how we got to this reality. It is, but it's much more than that. It's much more than that. And in fact, the Gemara says an amazing thing. Not just that there was one world before this, it says in the Talmud that God created 974 worlds and destroyed each one. So how can we understand that? Our first question is, well, I thought God is omnipotent. He can't get it right? What do you mean he created 974 worlds and each one was destroyed? So the way we can understand this is with a parable. In nature, when in the fall, the leaves fall to the ground, the fruit that has not been picked will fall to the ground. And in the course of the winter, by the end of the winter, it's all dissolved back into the earth. It's broken up back to the earth, and that becomes the food, becomes the life force for the tree to keep growing. Or the mashal of a butterfly, how it goes through its different stages until it becomes a butterfly. So that it's not a mistake. It's just that's how the process works. And so, like we said, this world is called the world of rectification. And this is really what we're doing in this world, is that it's in a sense, it's a very, very broken world. We're not living in a perfect reality here. That's the whole story of the Garden of Eden and the exile from the Garden of Eden. And in fact, there's three different ideas in the Torah and Jewish history that mirrors the breaking of the vessels. The first one is leaving the Garden of Eden. In other words, the utopian ambience of the Garden of Eden was in a sense too perfect. Human beings did not have the ability to integrate that kind of utopia. And so the exile, which we're all actually experience, is the breaking of the vessels. When Moses comes down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the law, and they're dancing around a golden calf, so he breaks the tablets. This is also the metaphor of the breaking of the vessels. Why? Just 40 days before, we received the Torah on Sinai, and God revealed himself in a way that was so awesome. But 40 days later, we didn't have the proper means to integrate such a revelation. And then we have the destruction of both temples. Again, this idea of breaking. So if we translate this to our own lives, we see that many times when we're challenged with a big test, when we're facing adversity and things just seem everything is going wrong and we don't really understand what is happening. God forbid tragedy strikes. And sometimes it appears like I'm finished. I don't know where to go from here. But many, many times when we look back, we realize that those situations led us to a whole new consciousness, or a whole new way of approaching life, or new relationships, or new jobs, or new places of living. But at the moment, it seemed like everything is falling apart. Everything is breaking. And yet, in many cases, it's what is needed to get us to the next level. So here we're taking a very mystical idea, and it's actually very much of our existential reality in very real terms. So here is Jacob telling his sons to go get food. And like I said, until this day, commentators are asking, did he understand what was about to happen? Or was he just the channel through which God was making it happen? And where was the line? Where was the line? Especially when he sent Yosef, he knew that Yosef and his brothers were not getting along. There was no great secret. And the question is, when he sent him from the valley of Hebron, from the deep prophecy that God had given Abraham, that your children will end up oppressed. And in the end, they will come out and I will bring everyone back to Israel and you'll inherit it forever. So this is kind of like a sub-theme that's running through these parshas, through these Torah portions right now. And so if for those who remember in the Seder of Pesach, the Haggadah of Pesach, there are 15 steps that we go through on the first night of Pesach. That's when we eat matzah and bitter herbs, and we tell the story. And there are 15 steps. The fourth step is called yachatz. Yachatz here means to break. It means to break. We take a matzah and we break it, and then we take the larger piece and we hide it away until the end of the Seder, and then we bring it back. And so this breaking, remember, this is Pesach night, and we're telling the whole story of how did we end up going down to Egypt, and what was the slavery like, and how God redeemed us. But there was a breaking. And so this part of the Seder, of the Haggadah, represents the breaking that Jacob saw. There's shever in Egypt. But the bigger piece is put away, and at the end of the Seder, it's brought back. And this represents exactly what I said before, that many times while we're going through a hard time, we don't necessarily understand, why is this happening? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to get out of this? Where do I go now? But when life doesn't just end there, and when we push through, a lot of times in retrospect, 2020 hindsight, we see we had to go through this. It's just that's what had to happen for us to move on, to progress. So now I want to take all of this and connect it to Hanukkah. It's Hanukkah now. So how does this connect? Well, what are we doing now? We're lighting lights in the time of the year that it's the shortest days and the longest nights. In other words, in nature, there's more darkness right now. In a few days is actually the winter solstice. So Hanukkah doesn't come exactly at the solstice, but we're almost at the the longest periods of darkness. And what are we doing? We're lighting candles. We're bringing light into the world. The Maccabees, at the time of the war with the Greeks, it was a very bad scene. It was a very, very bad scene. The Greeks had taken over the temple. They were ruling Israel with a very heavy hand. They began to forbid certain commandments from being fulfilled. A good number of Jews had assimilated, had become more like the Greeks than like a Jew. And it was a very, very dark time. But one family, Mattathias and his sons, they began a rebellion. And 3 years later, they had defeated, at that time, was the greatest empire in the world. The world had never seen such a great empire. The Greek Empire at that time had reached all the way to India. And here we're tiny little Israel is taking on the whole Greek Empire. So there was a lot of darkness. And people probably were thinking, like, this might be the end. How are we going to survive here? But we see that has happened many times in Jewish history. Many times in Jewish history, we've been kind of pressed to the end. Just 75 years ago, it also looked very bleak. And let's say 75 is already the end of World War II, but let's say in the middle of World War II, things looked as dark as they could be. But somehow, 3 years later, at the end of World War II, the state of Israel was reborn again. So this idea of breaking and rectifying is a cosmological idea. It's a mystical idea, but it's a very, very real, practical, psychological, emotional idea. And so here in Hanukkah, we light our lights in a way that what's called persuming Nisa. We're broadcasting the miracle. We're broadcasting that no matter how dark things seem to be, there will always be light at the end of the tunnel. But even more than that is, even when there is darkness around us, we should train ourselves to look at all the good. So many times when we have problems, we allow them to engulf us, to surround us. But if we would put things in perspective, we would see how much there is to be grateful for, how much potential for good there is in ourselves and others in the world. And I think that's really the state of the world right now. The state of the world is, we've gone through some pretty dark times these last 8 months. And just in general, when we look at the brokenness of the world, sometimes it's easy just to kind of give up hope and just, okay, I'm just going to survive here. But that's not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is to bring light into the world, to see what there is to be grateful for, to rectify, to heal. And that is the message of Hanukkah. So I just want to give everyone a blessing that we need a lot of light. We need a lot of light. And hopefully we can go very deep inside and find our own light and then share it with others. So thank you all.